7:42. 7:42. I'm sure it'll be up on the screen here shortly. There we go. Count your many blessings. And we have so many to count, don't we? Yes, sir, indeed. That's kind of funny. On the title of this particular song, this is what we normally associate with that title. But in the book, it has When Upon Life Billows. It has that title to the song. So, you know. Anyway, depends on what book you're looking in. Let's sing. First, second, last verse. When upon life's billows Song for the lesson of page 852, 852. Page 912 will be the song after lesson 912, Brother Al.
I actually brought this up. Is that a cat or a baby? Door creaking. Okay. All right. That sounded like a cat or a baby. So I actually brought this up several weeks ago when we started the series on the churches of Asia, and so I stuck it back here on the back burner. I had thought about doing a summarization, and then I decided not to, of the Church of Asia. But the idea of cups, and it's kind of this deal. When we go into it, the Lord said the problem that some people had, they would strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. And I've heard people say, well, it's okay to strain as a gnat as long as you don't swallow a camel. Okay? Justification, that's what we end up with, is self-justification. Same would say, well, as long as you don't, you can swallow a camel as long as you don't strain at a gnat. Well, the Lord was actually condemning both and the attitude of both. And what we need to think about some things, and we want to look at them, and I want to start because this is concerning the Lord's Supper. And I want to start by looking first at Matthew, and we'll get to Luke, and we'll look at some things around this, because I think the more we look at the idea and the antitype of it and how things proceeded, the more we can understand about it, and the less we can worry about it. Okay? And it's not necessarily a problem we have here, but there's a problem other people, and sometimes they get the influence in it. In fact, it's not that long ago, and probably about the time this came up, that I read the statement that the true church uses one cup and one loaf. Big loaf. We'll get to there too. Okay? Now notice here it tells us, and as they were eating, okay? Now some want to argue about, well, is this the end? I think it was probably at the end, and there's reason to think of that, but it's that as a part of the supper, okay? As they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. Then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Now notice where the placement of that last statement is according to Matthew, because that's going to be important when we get into Luke. Okay? I think sometimes, and I like James W. Garvey's The Fourfold Gospel, because it tends to put things together. Sometimes we miss things and looking at each of them and don't even catch it. But here's the thing. What we need to go back and understand is this night was part of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. It had all become called the Passover. And how things changed and how things were different. Now, we picked Exodus chapter 12, verses 13. This is when it's talking about that night, what they were to do and what they were to do later, as far as the passing over of their firstborn children. It says, now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I'll pass over you, and the plague will not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. I know, so this day shall be for you, to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast of the Lord throughout your generation. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat the unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. And notice that he ties that in. The Lord ties that in. And note, for whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at evening you shall eat unleavened bread until the first day of the month at evening, or 21st day of the month. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened, and all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Now that becomes important. Okay? Did he say, and then we need to understand because he stresses it so much, that they couldn't eat anything other than unleavened bread? Huh? The Lord. Because he told Moses, in that 7 days, because sometimes this is something we get into. God at this point, God in Exodus. Except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That was on that holy convocation. The only thing they were able to do was to prepare food for everyone to eat, which would include the time of the Passover meal. Okay? Because the reason I want to get this across, notice how he said, you shall eat nothing leavened. That's the specification. Your bread is to be unleavened bread, and anything else you eat is not to have any leaven in it. That becomes important because it starts teaching us what God's expectation. Now notice it said the 14th day to the 21st day. Okay? When we start going back, look at this point. This month shall be the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of the month, every man shall take for him a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. Now, what it says is, and you go on, but that lamb is not to be sacrificed until that 14th day. Okay? Now, what are they doing on the 10th day? They're finding that lamb that doesn't have spot or blemish. That perfect lamb to arbor. And they're keeping it away from the others. They're preparing it. Okay? Who had to sanctify those lambs? That's going to become important too. The priest. Okay? Who they are an agent of? God. Okay? And we're going to talk, a lot of this is focused more on the Lord's Supper than it is on whether or not there's one cup, but we get into that because we need to focus. That's where the focus is supposed to be. Leviticus 23:4-8, Moses writes, these are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall eat a holy convocation. You shall no customary work in it, but you shall make an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. The 7th day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. Now Moses gives these dates. Now, when was Moses given these dates? Where was Moses when he writes Leviticus? Let me put it that way, as far as we know. Huh? In the wilderness. Whether or not he was on the mountain, I don't know. But we know he was in that 40 years that he was in the wilderness. Okay, what happened over time? People were forgetting. People were making amendments to it. Okay? We need to understand that point. There come an idea of, if we're taking because you had back in Leviticus, it said on the 14th day was the first day of the unleavened bread. How do you do the unleavened bread and the Passover? How do you do any work without preparing things? And the idea that it's always also supposed to fall on the Sabbath. Here is 2 verses we want to look at concerning the Lord's Supper. Okay? Because what I want to get us some understanding, some days have been moved. Notice, now on the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Now, what day is this? I'm not looking for a date or anything, huh? Well, that was Brian. I don't. What it should be. Well, what we want to look at is pay attention to what it says there. The first day of the feast of unleavened bread. This is when everybody was taking that first day of the. You know what I'm saying? We'll get into what Kaufman says in a minute concerning that point there, because the 10th would be the day that they picked that lamb. The 14th was actually first day that they would eat. Okay. Notice the point: prepare for the Passover. Now, the problem is the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread had been incorporated together. Here comes another point. Okay. Now notice this. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciple says to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" Okay? It implies that it's going to be that Passover lamb if we're not careful. Here's the thing. When did the Jewish day start? In the evening. Twilight, around 6 o'clock. Okay? Could you have a feast of unleavened bread at night and the Passover lamb be killed during the daytime? To be eaten the next night. Because notice he says this when they killed the Passover lamb. So that puts it either they had the unleavened bread the first day that night and the lamb killed the next day during the day, or this is a second day. Okay. Now notice this. This is from Kaufman's commentary on Mark. On the first day of unleavened bread, the Jewish Passover always began at sundown on the 14th of Nisan. The following day, the 15th of Nisan, actually being the Passover day. The first day of unleavened bread was preceding day, the 13th of Nisan, beginning at sundown on the 12th of Nisan. Since Christ died at the same hour, the Paschal lambs were slain. That is at 3 o'clock p.m. That's his opinion, comment. On the 14th, the event Mark mentioned here took place on the afternoon of the daytime, Nisan 13. Of course, the meal that followed those preparations took place after sunset, the beginning of a new day by Jewish reckoning, therefore on Nisan 14th, or the 14th of Nisan. What is he saying? Okay, what we would call Thursday would end at twilight. Friday at twilight would begin. So even though they're saying on that first day of the unleavened bread, it is looking toward that evening, partaking of that unleavened bread, and the lambs being prepared for the actual Passover the next afternoon, what we would call Friday, and that Sabbath beginning on the other. Thus, you have what John refers to as the preparation day. Therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, they might be taken away. That goes back to a law in Deuteronomy that Moses points out that they were not to leave dead on a high Sabbath. They were not to leave them like they were supposed to do something about them or have to leave them through the following, and they didn't want to do that. They weren't to do anything with the dead during that high Sabbath. Anyone that did have anything to do with the dead couldn't participate in it. So there comes that point of looking at the realization of what he was partaking of. Now, it would be interesting if God had told us what happened the previous Passovers he was alive, but he didn't. It might change our thought on it. But we get into this point concerning the Lord's Supper. Now, we looked at the two things concerning Mark. We looked at Matthew's initiation. Mark's is very similar to Matthew's account. Notice, and as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it them, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said, "Blood of the new covenant was shed for many. Surely I say to you, I will no longer drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." There are a few obscure translations that want to say a cup. When we get into the problem is the cup. And what we have to understand, in the Jewish Passover and on the unleavened bread, during that supper, there was various cups they used. The final cup was called the cup of praise. So many want to go to the point of this must have been the cup of praise. There was also a cup that was never touched. It was filled with wine, and it was left, and it was never touched. Because it was for a specific person. Do you know who it was for? Reasonable that it was for God. Okay? How about? That's something that they came to do in their tradition. Okay? Need to back up. I don't either. All right. But that cup was for the Messiah, looking pointed toward the Messiah. Now, Ron brought up interesting thing, traditions that they brought up. Sometimes we want to discount traditions. Where in the Old Testament do we find the institution of the synagogue? when it was established. Who was it established by? It was by the Jews. They're the ones that made that rule. You had to have 10 Jewish men. They're the ones that made the way to worship in that synagogue. Nowhere do we find God saying, do this. Okay? But where do we find Jesus on the average Sabbath? So even though they did it by their tradition, he shows us his approval being there. Perhaps it was not Holy Spirit inspired as we want to look at it, but yet God providentially done. In fact, our pattern of worship follows the pattern of the synagogue, as far as in singing and praying and teaching. That's going to be according to your study and your opinion. But God approved a lot of things. And when we turn around and say, well, they're just traditions, we could kick out a lot. Paul warned the Thessalonians about not following his what? Traditions. So here looking at Mark, going over to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul writes, for I received from the Lord that which I had also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the same night in which he was betrayed took bread, and when he given thanks, he broke it and said, take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. Now, there is no doubt when you look at those two and this one here, we're going to come to that point that this was in using, but it was after they had eaten. That's what he means, after they had eaten, after the supper. This point that he takes it, and there's where the question comes in. Another question go in there, what about his body? Was any bones broken? But yet Paul says his broken body. Huh? The flesh was broken. Dead is broken. Dead is broken. There you go. Something won't work anymore. What do we call it? We call it mechanic. We call it broke. Okay? The body was no longer functioning. Okay? Now, not a bone was broken, but the side was pierced. The skin was broke, as Kathy accurately said. So my point is, let's be careful what we strain at, because that's what gets into the cup. Okay? Whether or not it was meant to be a cup for the Messiah, I don't know. I don't know which cup he chose. I don't know if it was the cup of praise. I know he took a cup, but a cup of particular importance. Okay? And what he was doing with it is where the importance comes in. Now let's take a look at Luke, because this is where it gets really interesting for those who say one cup. Okay? Then he took the cup and gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among yourselves. Okay? Now notice what Luke says after that. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Now that's what Mark and Matthew record at the end of the supper. After he takes that cup, after they record that he takes that cup, it says the same thing, or it says, what he says later here. Now notice, and he took bread. Okay, English teachers, help me out. What does that mean, that and? Is that not at the same time? In addition to. It's conjunction. So he did the cup and he took bread. He moved from the cup to the bread. Okay? He tells them do what with it? Divide it among themselves. It's almost as if, and not being there and not seeing it firsthand, it's that he tells them divide it among themselves, and as they're dividing it among the 12 of them, do you know ever catch that Judas partook of the Lord's Supper that night? And while they were doing that, he took the cup, or took bread, gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. Okay? You ever take something and pass it around? I mean, I'm not the only one that does that at dinner, right? My house, or when I grew up, what we did was whatever was set before you, you got it first. Then you took it and you passed it. We all passed in the same user. What happened when we got done? It got back to that person that was next to you. It's sitting right back in front of you. Right? So that cup gets passed around, divided among them. It's right back there to him. And he takes it and said, this cup is a new covenant of my blood, which is shed for you. That you just divided among yourselves. This is it. Okay? For the skeptic, prove me wrong. See, those who hold the one cup said, this is a different cup. Why would it be a different cup? When you take these things, what he says up there after he tells them to divide it among themselves, the same thing he says after taking that cup and saying what he says at the bottom, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you, in Matthew and Mark. Sir? Huh? Yes, but there were more than one cups throughout the supper. Okay, but it is pointing to this cup. But you're right. In this context, if it was a different cup, it would specify it was a different cup. Well, that's what they did. They poured it into individual cups is what they did. That's what he said. Divide it among yourselves. Typically is the argument. Okay. Matthew, he said, take it and drink it a bit. Is that thought? You drink all that's in there, or is it all of you drink of it? That dividing of it. The problem we're getting into is we're straining at the wrong thing. There's a point that God is telling us, divide it, or that we can divide it, and that we ought to. Here's the absurdity of straining at a gnat. Now, I want you to understand something. Because, first of all, if it's one cup, it has to be one loaf. The Gospel Advocate commentary by C. Doris, if I'm not mistaken, on Mark, does that. It says it's to be one loaf and it's one cup. He says it's to be one loaf and it's to be one cup. Okay. That is practice and something. But go as far as to say it is absolutely to be that way. Okay? Here's the deal. If it's to be one loaf and it's to be one cup, then certainly it would follow that it's to be in one place. Huh? One place. Now let's start there. Let's start with the illusion that it's not to be in one place. Because here was the thing. Where was the Passover to be done? Where was it supposed to be sacrificed? They ate it in each house, but where was it sacrificed? Where was it to be? Not the upper room. The temple, Jerusalem. They were all to go to Jerusalem for the Passover. Now notice what Jesus says here in talking to the woman of Samaria. She says, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that Jerusalem is a place where one ought to worship. Notice Jesus said to her, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. What did he do? He said there's a time coming when that won't even matter, but right now, we know what we're doing. And worshiping in Jerusalem is the place to worship. But he's saying that's going to be done away with. And it's going to be done. He goes on to say that those who truly worship God worship him in spirit and truth. But he said the hour is coming, and now is, when true worshipers. Okay? So the idea of one place is already, Jesus said, nope. Right? Now, let's try this one out. How big were those loaves? Anybody got an idea? Yeah, you got it big. That's a big loaf. Catherine said about this big. That's a big one. That was a big, about like our dinner roll. Except, guess what? It was unleavened. So what was it? Hard as a brick. That's part true too. And guess what else it was supposed to have? What was it supposed to be made with? Bitter herbs. Isn't it funny how people want to strain that? Well, we need one loaf, but they don't want them. And the unleavened is true, but we don't worry about them bitter herbs, do we? Okay? Now, I want to point out something here. You go to one loaf, how big that loaf got to be? Look here at first in Acts 40 through 41. And with many other words, he testified, exhorted them, he being Peter, be saved from this perverse generation. And those who gladly received his word were baptized. That about 3,000 souls were added to them. Now, the only person I've ever seen feed that many souls was Jesus. And guess what? How many loaves did it take him to feed the 4,000? And to feed the 5,000? And we called that a miracle. And it was a miracle because they took up baskets full afterwards. Okay? You could even think people could pinch off of it and get 3,000 people. You needed Jesus. Ma'am? Egypt. That was the bread. They were prepared unleavened with bitter herbs. Because of the hurry of the way, they would not have time to let it rise. Because they were prepared, they were eat this Passover, and the next day, guess what? They're getting out of town. It's supposed to be headed to the promised land. It took them 40 years to get there. Because they wouldn't follow directions. It took them 40 years to get there. But you're right. when we're headed our pride, that's why Paul writes that the bread we eat, the blood we drink is our Passover. Okay? So here they are, that point, 3,000. Now you get to the end of the chapter, so continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to the church daily those who are being saved. Daily. So minimum in a week's time, they got at least 3,100 people trying to take a Lord's Supper. And it's gaining daily. And then we open up Acts chapter 3. We find Peter and John healing the lame man and preaching in the temple and that. And we open up chapter 4. And we find here in verse 1 now, as they spake to the people, the priest and the captain of the temple and the Sadducees came upon him, being greatly disturbed that they taught the people and preached in Jesus the resurrection from that. Huh? Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection dead. We're totally stupid if you can prove there's a resurrection of the dead. You've killed our whole doctrine. Okay? Now, and they laid hands on them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. However, many of those who heard the word believed, and the number of the men came to be about 5,000. Just the men. So how many are we going to have worship on Sunday? Now we're up to 8,000. How do you do one loaf between 8,000 people? How do you do one cup without it taking all day between 8,000 people? Is God the author of confusion? Yes or no? Let me ask you a question, and you're in the Bible, you're just going to have to use your brain. Is God the author of common sense? Did you ever take time to look at the book of James? How many books of wisdom literature are in the Old Testament, Ray? Do you know offhand? Trying to think. I want to say at least 4. Okay? Probably more than that, because you have Proverbs, you got Job, that's considered wisdom literature. You got Ecclesiastes. Anyway, how many you got in the New Testament? How many do we break down and call them wisdom literature? Most people call James a book of wisdom. He speaks all throughout it. But you know what other scholars call it too? Common sense wisdom. How many times does God point out things that should be common sense? Think about Romans 6, verses 1 and 2. What shall we do? Continue in sin that grace may abound? Now, King James says, God forbid. New King James says, certainly not. Greek would actually translate it in its context as, that's absurd. And what does that mean? That don't even make sense. Common sense. We're supposed to be able to reason everything out. We're supposed to be able to understand with reason. That's what we're trying to do. Does it make sense to try to hold people to one cup and one loaf? I understand that point. Well, and that's, but let me come back to that. did it ever make sense? Okay. Well, they do it, but it does. And the thing is, they got that one cup and they got that napkin to wipe it every time somebody takes a sip. If they let them take a sip, a lot of times, the old days, Catholic Church, nobody partook of the cup except the priest. See? But was that what God intended? What did God intend for us to understand about the Lord's Supper? Let's go back to 1 Corinthians 11. He intended for us to understand that the bread was to remind us of the body that the Lord gave upon the cross, the body that had our sins placed upon it, the Lamb of God sacrificed for us. He intended for us to blood was shed so that we could be our sins, and that it was his son that did this thing. Now notice what he says here through Paul. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. That drinks of the cup or the contents of it. So with it being the contents, doesn't matter if it's a little individual cup or one. You remember that what matters is what's in the cup. Yes.
So why do we carry over some of the Jewish traditions?
What traditions are we carrying over? What we have in the Lord's Supper is what the Lord gave us. We don't carry over the whole tradition. We don't do 7 days of unleavened bread. We don't clean all the leaven out of our house. We don't put herbs in the bread. We put what he pointed, that unleavened bread. That's what I'm saying. Those who would strain it, whether it has to be one loaf or one cup, need to get some bitter herbs in their bread. Okay, okay, not may. Yeah, okay, well, I stand corrected on that. Here's the thing that we're looking at. Here's what I want to understand something. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, Paul says, test all things, hold fast to that which is good. We're testing. Now, when we test things, we have to be willing to change our minds. Is there anything in this that says we should change to one cup or to one loaf? Yes, ma'am. You're absolutely right. It's a contest. And notice what God says further. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner, eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. Where's the problem in doing it wrong? Not the body. Okay? If we focused on that, as much as they want to focus on whether it's one cup or one loaf, we'd be a lot better off. Here's the other thing. Who gets to partake of it? Yes, it has. But what does the scripture say? Who gets to partake of it? He drink. What did you say? Whoever examines himself. What if a person doesn't examine himself? Wait a minute. And takes of it unworthily. Do we get to stop them? No. So it's whoever chooses to. And let me tell you something. Sometimes we get the idea that, well, we want to ask people whether or not they were a Christian, don't know, and bypass this and do closed communion. And guess what? If they are discerning that body better than we are they drinking damnation to themselves? Now, before you say, well, possibly, and as one guy told me, we need to stop them so they don't drink damnation to themselves. And my answer was, if they haven't been forgiven of their sins and they're not a Christian, because that's what you're proposing, what are they? What are they on the day of judgment? Lost. What is another word for lost? Damned. That's what damnation means. They're damned. Okay? So if they already have that damnation upon them, how much more can they have? And what can we do if we refuse to let them partake of the Lord's Supper? What are we really doing? Driving them away. That's why we have an open communion. So let me one of them places. Make sure if you don't know, take your little bread and take your little grape juice through the vine and pray over it as they're praying over there. Would it be wrong? You know the only people that would say it was wrong? Are the ones that want to hold to that you've got to drink from the same cup. I heard of a preacher that went to one of those time, and I'm not so sure he was right in what he did because he went there to make a statement. So when the cup came around to him halfway through, he drank it all. Saying, well, it said, drink you all of it. And they were of the mind that everybody had to drink from the same one, that they would refill it and start over. And that's where he's trying to do. He's like, I'm trying to show you how you're not really discerning the Lord's body because you're straining at all these gnats. That's right. I can't call them wrong for doing that. Here's what I can call them wrong for doing. When they tell me I'm wrong and I can't divide it, they have stepped over the side of trying to discern the Lord's body and becoming the judge. You have, and I'll be honest, this study started about 12 years ago. In fact, longer than that, 16 years ago. Because I had people continually sending me emails and letters telling us how we at the church, because somebody had visited and told all these other churches what we were doing wrong. There you go. That's what it comes back to. That's right. And Ron, on your note, just like one going over there and saying you're not truly discerning because you're more worried about the tradition, the ritual, than you are what's in it being wrong. The one who is doing right the opposite by saying that you got to keep this ritual are just as guilty as he is.
This is just an observation. Catherine and I attended church about, well, normally we have those small cups. They had a big shot glass that took communion up, red shot glass, they drank all of that. There'd be several of the little ones that we use.
Well, yeah, and I remember the kid watching the cups, watching the little cups. They were a little bigger than what we use, and I remember watching those people that were under that, drank you all of it, making sure every drop got done. And unlike us, who put it back in the tray, the congregation we were at this one Sunday, we went to a different one, had little corrections places on the pew. I was probably 5, 6 years old, and I watched that all go by, and I saw it sitting there. My brother's looking at me, and I reached down and took it and went like this. And next thing I know, I put Mama's hand on the back of my head. And that wasn't the end of it.
Well, what is it when I've seen mothers or parents give their children the Lord's Supper? And that bothers me the most is the children don't know what it is.
How do you know? What have they been taught?
Yes,
What have they been taught? So back, and I tried to look at it, and I don't know what, I know it's in a book back there. I did manuscript. I tried to look at it. I want to say it was either 2013 or 14. I spoke on leadership on this very thing. And that question came up. Should the church tell the parents that the children can't partake of it? My answer was no, they don't have that right. They're still under that examination in oneself. If they've taught them children what it means to take of that Lord's Supper, where do we have a right to tell them they can't? There's still that tender vine. Do we want to cut that thing off at the root? No. So that it may bother me personally, but that's my problem. Jackie Steersman told one time, the question came up and we're running a little over. Was asked, how old is a child to be before he can be baptized? Huh? Well, that's a problem with a lot of people. That was a problem when somebody brought it up. Jackie asked him, why they be baptized? He said, well, they need to realize they have sin. Well, if they realize they have sin, if they're old enough to realize they have sin, then what's wrong with them being baptized? What if they don't want to sin? What if they want to do what's right? Maybe they don't understand the commission of sin, but what if they want to do what's right? Why was the Lord baptized? Right. Now, he told us a story of this couple that brought their son to him at 9 years old, and they were like, we don't know if we should let him be baptized or not, and we want you to talk to him, we want you to understand. So right there with them there, he asked him some questions, and first question he asked, he says, why do you want to be baptized? And he says, because I know I'm supposed to be taken of the Lord's Supper. Wait a minute, I know I'm supposed to be taken of the Lord's Supper, and I can't do it right if I'm not baptized. Jackie baptized him that afternoon. He was accountable. He understood. He didn't fully understand everything, but he understood enough to know that he needed to be a Christian. So here it comes back to, who brought the child to Jackie? parents. Who gets to make that decision? The child and the parents. When Jackie, as he pointed out, when that child looked at them, he looked at the parents. You want to know anything else? He had a list of questions. That was the only one he asked. And let me tell you something about Jackie. Jackie was a grown man. He'd been studying, working in a coal mine. Had this idea that before he was baptized, he's going to figure out everything that he was doing wrong and fix that and find out everything he needed to be doing because he didn't want to do anything wrong. Now, here he is working on the coal mine, down there chiseling away, and this big chunk of the roof comes and pins him to the ground. There guys working, trying to get him out of there. So it's just slowly taking his air away. And he had not been baptized, and he made this prayer: Lord, you get me out of this mine. I will go baptized today. Whatever I know that's wrong, I'm going to fix. Whatever I don't know that's right, I'm going to do. And whatever I find out afterwards, I'm going to take care of it. No reason to wait anymore. Same thing as a little child. If they know they need forgiveness, they may not know everything they need to know, but if they know that enough that they desire it, why do we hold them back? And on the flip side, if they know that's something they ought to do, you could destroy them by telling them no. They may never. They may never. And it might be that they're not exactly knowing what they're doing, but they may learn later. What's wrong with that? Okay. In fact, I baptized an 80-year-old woman that originally been baptized when she was 15. It didn't do it in the baptistry either. It did it in a swimming pool because the baptistry was being repaired. All the things that people question. Here's the deal. When we sit down and talk, when she came to me and wanted to talk about it, my question was, why do you want to be? She goes, I cannot remember why. Why I did it. I cannot remember, and I do not want any doubt going into the judgment. Okay? If she was baptized for the wrong reason, wrong action, what have you, as a child, it's taken care of. If everything was right, guess what? What's the big deal? Her conscience was leading her to try to be right with the Lord no matter what you do. How can you lose? It's a win-win. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's stressed more about the damnation
Mm-hmm.
Is the reason we're taking the Lord's Supper.
Well, and there that's a edged sword, because taking it in the wrong manner leads to damnation. The failure to do so leads to damnation. Following the proper example. I was thinking, and I was trying to look where Paul tells Timothy, neglect not the gift that was bestowed upon you. Not so much that he was neglecting, but just a reminder not to neglect it. You know what they're doing when they don't partake of it? They're neglecting this gift. This is a gift. And you're right. Sometimes we need to think about that. The privilege. Importance of the privilege.
And I just want to make sure it has to be a fine balance, or we can't, like you were saying, it has to be a fine balance.
And we need to stress that, not so,
Why we're doing it to start.
some of us. And you know, part of their argument is true. Okay? That it can become meaningless, but only to those who are not taking time to discern it. Guess what it's become to them? They're kind of like the Laodiceans. They don't even see that in reality it's become meaningless to them. Because if it really meant what it ought to, it wouldn't be once a quarter or twice a year. And have you ever been in one of those? I know Don, where he probably. I said, in one of those denominations where on that day they partake of the Lord's Supper? They put any more emphasis on it than we do? Sometimes not even as much. I remember the time stayed at my grandmother's. It was interesting to me. We ended up driving right by there. The Baptist church and the house, or where the house used to be. Now there's a Dollar General store, and I was telling Casey all about this little town, and just because of all the childhood memories coming up. And you bringing that up, remember me the one Sunday that me and my brother just died and a sister that's in between us, were there for about 10, 12 days. Staying there while Mom and Daddy had to go back to California to take care of some business, and they left us there for her to watch them. And on Saturday, we said something about going up to Montrose, which is about 6 miles away, how we were going to get to the church up there. That was the closest Church of Christ. That's where we'd go if we were there on Sunday. And I can remember her this day. You are not going to that Camelot church tomorrow. You are come with me. Y'all always go up there to that Camelot church, and I never get to show off my grandchildren, at least for y'all, at my church. So we go there. We had never been in that church. That was true. Didn't know what to expect. They had the piano, they had the organ, they had the singing, they had the choir going. Everybody's singing with the choir. And lo and behold, they had the Lord's Supper. Mom and Daddy get back, and we're headed home, and we told them that she made us go to church. Mom, I said, well, I told them. And I said something about, yeah, she goes, and I said, we even had the Lord's Supper. Mama, you always said they hardly ever had the Lord's Supper. They had the Lord's Supper. She goes, well, y'all were there on Christmas Day. Of course they had the Lord's Supper. That and Easter, guaranteed those two, they're going to have it. That's what she said. Of course they had it. And so that thought, that idea, and I remember those guys weren't up there any longer than we would be. So next time they say they put more emphasis on it, do they? Do they? You're right. We need to stress that point, because some of these people that are taking of it may not be thinking about what a privilege it is. I think that's part of discerning it. Catherine, real quick, we're running.
Mother, let's think about a mother. As Lord's Supper's coming around, and she's got 2 on her knees, and one is crying, and she takes the Lord's Supper. I think mothers have done that since centuries.
How long do you have to discern it to discern it? But you said about mothers, okay. How about single dads?
Well, the same thing, and even with small children, you can't put all your mind on it at that moment.
How much of your mind do you have to put on it in that moment you're taking of it to discern it properly? All of it, but for how long? From the time seconds. We want to make it from the time that they get up there to the time. Should I be paying attention to that? But see, I'm of the deal. I understand what you're talking about because Jillian, less than 6 months old when she started being able to go to church with me. Alex was 2.5 when she was born, to the very day. So I've got a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old. Now hers easy. Him, get over here. Okay. I remember one Sunday I'm sitting over there between the bread and between the cup, just as it was dead quiet, right after they said the prayer, and he's over there with my quiet. I'm like, shh. And he goes, shut up. And I hear this woman right behind me go, uh-oh. And so 3 seconds later, after it goes by, and I'm thinking a little bit of that, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, Lord, I got something I got to take care of, but I do know what this means. That's exactly I do know what this means. And I take of it, I turn around, I hand that woman Jillian. Boom, I laid hands on him and took him to the back. I figured since she knew, she knew what was about to come. And it's interesting because somebody said years later, Jillian was probably about 13, 14. We went there visiting. I was out of preaching school. Stopped one night, was at the, and somebody said, oh, I remember Jillian, this girl. She goes, she was the church baby. Because whenever I had something to do in the worship service, you didn't know where she was going to be. I remember one time leading singing, this woman, Virginia Horn, had told me, she says, you're supposed to lead singing, I'll take care of her today, okay? And she's got her there playing with one of these lipstick cases, and all of a sudden she bapped Virginia right in the nose with it. And I was like, bet you don't, and right there in my mind was, I bet you don't volunteer to take her anymore. She was giving her a fit, okay? Is it true it can be difficult? Yes. But who does it come back to? Let a person examine themselves. They have to make that decision. And you know what? What are they teaching them children? By example.
Because some others won't come back.
If you tell them they can't, if you criticize them for, why would they? Yeah, I had somebody sit there and tell me one time he was making too much noise. Alex. I said, where do you want me to take him? He goes, what? I said, you want me to go over here across the street to the denomination? Well, no, you need to be here, but you need, well, why don't you take care of you and I'll take care of me? And I actually asked him, you ever been in a church where there's no children? You attend a church where there's absolutely no children long enough, you'll be glad to hear a baby crying. You ever notice what I do when babies start crying? Huh? You ever? So I don't get louder. I remember one little boy back here one time, it was almost a contest, see who could get the loudest. I'm going to preach over him, huh? Don't have, there you go, buddy. You got to worry about it. So here's what it comes back to. Criticism has driven off too many people, where the Lord told us it's none of your business. Think about that. What the Lord told you was, when he says, let a man examine himself, the responsibility is his, and it's none of my business. Unless he comes to me and says, help me. So why are we going where the Lord said don't go? Guess what? That's the same thing with that one cup, going somewhere the Lord didn't say to go. All this is personal feelings, trying to bind them up on someone else. That's all it comes down to. If you believe there's only to be one cup, guess what? Bring your own cup. That's my thought of it. And it's an interesting thing because we sit there and say, well, there's no reason not to be in fellowship with them, right? It's a matter of their opinion, right? If that's what they want to do, they have a right to do it, right? But why is it that they always say, no, we can't be in fellowship with you? Think about this. What Jesus said was, in vain they do worshiping me, because they have made the commandments of men the doctrines of God, or the traditions of men. We need to be careful. You strain into that, and you swallow a camel, making your traditions greater than the commandments of God. That's where we're at. That's the end. Okay? Don, you got invitation song? Let's stand.
Dismiss us, please.